Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. Today we have David Burns, MD. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Great to be on the show again. It's an honor.
Thank you. David Burns, you can find his podcast, the Feeling Good Podcast, on iTunes, his website, feelinggood.com, and his book, Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy, which is the #1 book in the subject of anti-anxiety.
And antidepressant, actually.
And antidepressant.
Yeah.
Let's begin, but with your background. You came from a family that's religious. Your father was a religious man.
Yes, in fact, the day I was born, which was a Sunday, he said it was the only day he couldn't preach a sermon. He was so excited. And so he called me D.D. Burns because he was Lyle Charles Burns D.D., Doctor of Divinity, a Lutheran minister. So he thought one day I would be D.D. Burns D.D. And when I was little, it was just assumed that I was going to be a minister when I grew up. But eventually things changed. They went in, pretty different direction into psychiatry. But it's interesting, kind of now in my elderly and semi-demented years, I'm coming back to spiritual concepts a lot, because what we do in treating, especially people with depression and anxiety, when the therapy is working in its deepest and more powerful way, you're generally working on a spiritual level as well as a psychological level.
That's very important. And for people who don't believe in spirituality but believe in science, how can you work with them?
Well, I'm all for people who work with science. I started out doing brain research before I developed my private practice and doing cognitive therapy for depression. But I've done published a lot of scientific articles on the brain, as well as on how psychotherapy works. But I'm all for science, and I'm not religious. I'm not a promoter of religion, but when a person suddenly gets transformed in a psychotherapy session, their symptoms suddenly and instantly disappear, and they have a kind of aha moment. It's like being born again, and then they can generally understand their own religious heritage, whether it's Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, whatever it happens to be. For example, a lot of depression comes about because of one of the 10 distortions they talk about, should statements, and a lot of experts throughout history have talked about the tyranny of should statements. The feminist psychiatrist Karen Horney talked about that in the 1950s, and she wrote on the tyranny of the shoulds. And I think my mother was depressed and got that book and found it helpful. But a lot of depression results from telling ourselves, I should be better than I am. I'm not good enough. I did on one of the Feeling Good podcasts recently, I worked with one of my co-therapists who I teach with at Stanford, Jill Levitt, a fantastic clinical psychologist and a lovely person. We love to do co-therapy, and we worked with a man, and this will be broken into about the session into 5 podcasts with commentary and explanation. But he talked about the fact that when he was a young man, he had 2 goals in life. And one was to become a really wonderful physician and do great work for his patients. And he said that he had accomplished that goal, and he is a tremendous physician, wonderful human being. His other goal was to have a large family of people, members who loved each other and supported each other. And although he now does have a large and loving family here in the U.S., he has a 40-year-old son that he's never, from a previous marriage, that he's never been able to get close to. And so he's telling himself, I've been a failure as a father, and I should be able to get closer to my son. And I think that's such a universal theme. You've got your radio show and your fantastic creative pursuits. What I really admire about you, you're living life as an adventure to see where it brings you. But you might sometime tell yourself, oh, I should have more followers, by more listeners, more money, more whatever. We all have the chance to beat up on ourselves. And then recovery involves the death of the ego, the death of the self. We talked about that at our dim sum brunch a few minutes ago. But to give up on the idea that you're supposed to be so special, and to accept the fact that you really aren't special. And there's a great liberation that occurs. But the death of the ego is frightening, because people don't want to give up their high standards and beating up on yourself, thinking if I beat up on myself, and criticize myself, eventually I'll achieve perfection, or eventually this wonderful thing will happen. And the only thing that happens most of the time is a lot of depression and frustration and anxiety and despair.
It's beautifully said. I always see it as riding a motorcycle with having the partner on the side, and the ego is a partner that's kind of taking a back seat.
Yeah.
But let me ask you now, you bring up spirituality, and you bring up something very similar to Jung's biography, just naturally, in the sense that his father was a religious man, and Jung created a spiritual psychology which has transcended psychology and become a very kind of unconscious-based effort of healing from within. You naturally come in a parallel dimension. You come from a religious background, and you've created the spiritual psychology that deals with taking one higher, away from bitterness, self-defeat, and anxiety.
Self-doubt, self-hatred, worthlessness, inferiority, hopelessness.
Yeah. So you brought up an absolutely beautiful image during our brunch about climbing a ladder, or finding a ladder from a black hole. So if all the listeners are, for example, for entertainment purposes, just feeling out their own black hole inside, and were to create that visual ladder, how does that work?
Well, I've developed or learned, let's just to simplify it, say roughly 75 techniques to help people recover from depression and anxiety, and also relationship conflicts. And the technique that works for each person might be a little bit different. For example, I work with a pretty successful man when I was living in Philadelphia. He came as a patient. He was always very, very anxious, and let's just say he was in a kind of a high stakes financial investment area, where you can make or lose vast amounts of money very quickly. And his problem was that he was anxious all the time, and thinking, I'm not earning enough money, and my colleagues are making millions, and I'm doing well, but we still have a fairly modest house, and worrying. And he kept thinking, ever since he was little, he thought he was kind of inferior, and he had to prove his self-worth by somehow making X amount of dollars every year. And I tried tons of techniques, help identify the distortions in his self-critical thoughts, and various ways to talk back to them. But it was never effective. I must have tried 15 or 20 techniques to help him get over this depression and inferiority and constant worrying. And then one day it occurred to me, I just happened to figure out that he came in and said, "Oh, Dr. Burns, I've been so anxious all week, and we've got to go back and talk about my childhood and my inferiority." But what it turned out was going on is that his boss had asked him to take a cut in salary, because there was a kind of a recession at the time, and so he agreed to it, valiantly, and doing his part. And then when he started talking to some other guys that he worked with in the firm over the next week or two, he learned that they had chosen not to take the cut in salary, and that he was the only one who was, taking a cut in salary to help the boss. Now, most of us would get angry about that, but he was this exceptionally nice fellow. So instead of being assertive with his boss, he developed all this anxiety, and I'm worthless, and this distracts him from the actual thing, that he's having a conflict with his boss. And I call that the hidden emotion model that I use in the treatment of anxiety. It's one of the 75 techniques. And I pushed him really hard to have a conversation with his boss, which he didn't want to do. He was so conflict phobic, thinking he has to be nice all the time. And so I just pushed him, and he went and he had a conversation with his boss, and the boss decided he didn't have to take this break in salary, and he became euphoric, and his anxiety and depression instantly went to zero. And and I call that the hidden emotion technique. And so for that man, every time for the rest of his life, when he falls out of enlightenment and starts getting anxious, it will always be the same thing, because he's being nice about something that's upsetting him, and he needs to bring his feelings to conscious awareness and express them. And so that's his ladder. Whenever he falls into the black hole of doubt or depression or anxiety and frustration, then he's got to remember, oh, I'm upset with somebody. I got to figure out who it is and express those feelings. And when he does, it will instantly disappear. And this didn't cause an improvement in his symptoms. It caused a complete elimination of all of his symptoms.
This is where art comes in too, because as someone who has done a lot of shows, I remember I did a show called The Power of Rejection, and a show called For the Special Ones, where I talked about when I was a kid and somebody throwing stones on my head and calling the K word, anti-Jewish K word, as a child. And I remember after expressing those things in shows with music and an audience, all of a sudden it relinquished that fear and that pain from me. How powerful is psychodrama? How powerful is art in this healing?
Well, I think that psychotherapy is an art form, and that's why it's so hard to teach. And I think a good therapist is like a healer, that you bring magic to the person. It's not just talking and feeling a little bit depressed, but it's bringing techniques that can cause a sudden and complete elimination of the patient's symptoms. The one last thing I didn't finish on that other story is that although that technique worked for him, it won't work for the next 30 people I see. Like for each, we all have our own little ladder to get out of. But once you found it for a person, it's always the same thing. But yes, when I was a medical student, we used to do psychodrama here in Palo Alto. I used to cut classes. I never should have gone to medical school. I was a horrible medical student. It was the wrong thing for me. I should have gone to psychology PhD, but I was pushed to go to medical school, so I obediently did it. And but there was this fellow, Hussein Shah, was this crazy, called himself a crazy Chinaman. And he had this place in Palo Alto called the Human Institute. And he would run these mainly 48-hour marathons where he'd get a group of 30 or 40 people. You may rent a house somewhere, and you'd sit in a circle, and then you'd get confronted one at a time until you crashed. And the idea, until you broke down in tears, they would really attack your vulnerabilities.
That can also hurt.
Oh yeah. It was very exciting, but it was scary. But that was where I first discovered that rapid change is possible for people. The only problem with it is it was kind of uncontrolled. And I went to my first psychodrama marathon about a half a mile from where we're sitting right now. There's a ranch here called Hidden Villa Ranch, and they had rented a house there, and that was, I went first as a student, just someone attending the marathon, and they confronted me, and it got really brutal. And then finally a friend came up and he grabbed me from behind, and he was kind of hugging me from behind, and then finally the tears came out. I hadn't cried since I was a child, because I'd had this kind of traumatic experience as a child and was told I wasn't supposed to cry, and it was really this cathartic, fantastic experience. But
have you cried since?
Yes, I still don't cry readily, but I'll often cry in workshops and when I'm teaching, particularly when I tell a story of somebody who whose life was transformed, who had been kind of a hopeless type case, who suddenly recovered. Often those stories bring tears to my eyes, and that's also when I get the highest ratings in the workshop, to show the humanness. And that's, I think, a lot of where the magic comes in, where you go from being a technician to a healer. A technician has all the scientific methods, and we have tremendous, cognitive therapy is the most researched form of psychotherapy in human history. It has all kinds of science behind it. But to be a healer is to be an artist, and it's to bring compassion, to bring magic to that process. So it's not just technical.
And by magic, we are also including the term spirituality. It's interesting, a lot of people, when they want to heal or get therapy or get better, they want to do things by the book, or do things in a dry way. And they may not believe, belief and faith and visualization. Aren't those the keys to the magic?
Well, those are aspects of magic. There's no one key to magic, I don't think. One person might respond to visualization techniques, the next person is going to say this is a waste of time type of thing. So it's good to have many tools in your toolbox.
How would you describe the magic you're talking about?
Well, it's where you suddenly go from. And of course, I'm working with people who are depressed and anxious, and often, suicidal, and really with the most severe of the most severe are the ones I've treated in my career for the most part. But an example would be a woman who came to me in Philadelphia. I hope we didn't talk about her on the last podcast. I can never remember what I've talked about from time to time. But she'd had 10 years of the most severe imaginable depression. And panic attacks. Did we talk about her at all? So. Well, she would have like 5 horrific panic attacks each week, where she'd start to hyperventilate and her chest would get tight, and then she'd become convinced that she was about to die of a heart attack. And the panic would be severe, and then she'd sit motionless, and after 20 minutes or so, the symptoms tend to disappear, and then she'd be terrified and humiliated and worrying about the next panic attack. And she'd had 10 years of failed therapy. The first 5 years, she would go to emergency rooms when she'd have these panic attacks, thinking she had a heart condition. And then they finally diagnosed panic disorder. And I don't understand why it takes people so long to diagnose panic disorder, because you can diagnose it in like 3 seconds. It's so obvious what's going on. And then they started referring her to psychiatrists and psychologists, and she had 5 years of aggressive psychopharmacology, taking every known antidepressant and all these drugs and high doses and all kinds of psychotherapy, and nothing helped. And then she came to me for treatment, and I was using it. In the old days, we used to call it cognitive therapy. Now we call it team CBT, because we have like this super high accelerated form of psychotherapy that's kind of beyond cognitive therapy. But the cognitive therapy had a lot going for it, even though it wasn't, perhaps the complete answer for many people. It was amazing for a lot of people. And so I asked her, what are your negative thoughts when you're having a panic attack? That's what you do as a cognitive therapist, because thoughts create emotions. See, this experience, this doesn't create our emotions. It's what we're telling ourselves. Your thought, I'm saying, boy, this is fun to work with Mikhail. We're going to have a great experience today. And so that makes me feel good. You're not making me feel good. The tape recorder's not making me feel good. And so when you're upset, it's your thoughts. And they're usually distorted. And the thought that she has is, I'm about to die. Now, I, as a physician, know that that's a false thought. When she has a panic attack, it is not a fact that she's about to die. And so I'm always trying to find a way to prove to the person that what they're telling themselves isn't true. And so about the 5th session, she allowed me to induce a panic attack in the session. I had her hyperventilate and close her eyes, and I said, you said visualize. I used negative visualization. I said, imagine now you're having a heart attack. We're going to have to call for the ambulance. Can you see the red light going around? Can you feel, I said, hyperventilate. I said, can you feel your chest getting tight? You can feel your skin tingling. And then she said, oh, Dr. Burns, I'm having a full-blown panic attack. Please, I'm about to die. I can't go on. And to make a long story short, I said to her, if you were about to die right now of a panic attack, what's one thing you could not do? And she was just said, I don't know what you're talking about. Please, I can't carry on. Please, Dr. Burns, I've changed my mind. I can't take it. I'm about to die. And then I said, if you were about to die, could you stand up right now and do some strenuous aerobic exercises? And she says, no, if I stand up, I'll pass out. Well, I knew she couldn't pass out because her heart is pounding, her blood pressure is elevated. Ooh, there's some buzzing. What's that? Oh, it was just something downstairs. Don't worry about it. It was just the washing machine downstairs or something. And she said, no, I'll pass out. Well, I knew physiologically she's not going to pass out because her heart is going fast, her blood pressure is elevated, and passing out is when your heart slows down and your blood pressure falls. So I said, well, let's check that out. Let's test it with an experiment. So she stands up, and of course she doesn't pass out. And then I said, well, now let's see if you can do some running in place. And she says, oh, no, I'm about to die. I said, well, do some running in place anyway. So she starts out real slowly, and I said, now come on, we got to bring on this heart attack. Start running faster. And then she said, oh, I can't, I'm about to die. And I said, well, then run a little faster then. And finally she stopped after about a minute. She said, I can't carry on. I said, well, let's do some jumping jacks then. And she says, no, I can't possibly do jumping jacks. I'm on the verge of death. I said, well, let's do some jumping jacks anyway. So she starts doing some jumping jacks. Now, conceptually, this is called the experimental technique. I'm trying to get her to do an experiment to find out if it's true that she's about to die. And there's our buzzing again, which will stop. That's good. And so, and listeners, forgive us for the sounds in the environment. It's not the end of the world. And so she started doing jumping jacks, and about 15 seconds into it, she said, I wonder if I could do this if I was having a heart attack. And then I said, is this what you see in emergency rooms of hospitals, patients standing next to their gurneys doing jumping jacks, patients with massive heart attacks? And she doubled over with laughter because at that instant she saw that she couldn't possibly be having a heart attack. And that was, and she recovered just in that instance. That ended 10 years of, misery. Her depression went to zero. Her anxiety went to zero. That was 25 years ago. And I have to call her every year to say, can I? Because I show the video of this in workshops. I say, can I keep showing the video? She says, I hope you show it to everyone in the United States and tell your workshop people I've been on a high the whole time, and it's been fantastic. But that's what I mean, to bring a person from a state of incredible suffering to a state of extreme joy. But her ladder now is to do jumping jacks. See, every time she gets upset, she'll think she's going to have a heart attack and die, and then she has to do her jumping jacks, and that will always work for her for the rest of her life.
It's almost like a double negative, yeah?
How do you mean there?
Well, let's say
you're probably right, but I don't
she's
grasp
in a
it.
negative, situation. You mirror or multiply that by 2 to her or to anyone, and then all of a sudden it just becomes ridiculous.
Well, humor and ridiculousness is fascinating because when people recover, at the point of recovery, my patients, not always but often, burst into uncontrollable laughter, as she did. And the Buddhists have a name for that. They call it laughing enlightenment, where at the moment of enlightenment you're confronting your worst fear and discovering that the boogeyman has no teeth, the monster has no teeth. And so anyway, that's like one form of magic, but for each person it's a little different. For me, it's the acceptance paradox that's the magic that works for me.
And can you describe that?
Well, you see, I used to think too that I had to be so special. And as a therapist, I used to think I have to be able to cure every patient. Other therapists can fail, but I'm above that. And it was my ego was hooked into this idea that I was going to become such a great therapist that I could cure any patient, even against their will, type of thing. And then I used to get all these horribly severe patients with borderline personality disorder come in and say, Dr. Burns, I'm going to kill myself, and you can't stop me, and you can't help me. And I used to take that as some kind of challenge. Do you see? And then I would go into battle with the patient because of my ego. And then a day came when I said, this is such a burden. I'm doing all the work. And I learned to say to patients that you can't help me, to say, you're right, I haven't helped you, and it's painful for me, and let's talk about it, and tell me what's not working, and tell me what I'm not understanding, and tell me the problems I haven't been helping you with. And suddenly I started getting breakthroughs with people I had been stuck with. And so for me, the enlightenment was just accepting, and my cats have helped me with this too, just accept the fact that, I'm not special. I'm not even worthwhile. I'm just grateful to be alive. It's fun right now. I'm hanging out with you. What a gift that is.
It is a gift.
It's just fun. We didn't eat some special lunch, but we sure had fun
Right.
at it.
Just chose random things, liked them or not liked them.
Yeah.
Didn't have to like them.
Right. And so for me, a lot of when I suffer, it's because I tell myself I'm failing. I should have taught more effectively last night, or something like that, or I shouldn't have made this mistake, I should have made that mistake. And then for me, it's just the acceptance paradox, just accept, okay, well, I did screw up at that, and I'll often screw up at things, and that's okay. And when you no longer need to be special, life becomes special. But you can say those words, and people don't understand it.
That's a powerful statement. When you no longer need to be special, life becomes special.
Yeah, and it's a biblical statement. Like when you lose your life, you inherit the world. There's, I don't know if that's
not
Jewish or Christian, or you can die every day. The death of the ego is a fantastic thing.
You brought up some important points. If you happen to, you're being not a therapist, just a regular person, let's say you have people in your life who...
Are you a regular? I thought you were an irregular person.
Hopefully over here I'm regular. So if you have people in your life who, let's say, have thoughts about hurting themselves, and they maybe use that, either it's real, or sometimes it can be used as manipulation to say, if you don't do this, or if you don't come back, I'm going to hurt myself. In those situations, whether it's real or whether it's manipulated, what can anyone do to protect themselves and that person?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question. I can just say a couple things off the top of my head. And answering for the lay audience is different from answering for therapists who find themselves in that position, because the strategies could be somewhat different. But one thing is that the biggest mistake that lay people make, and therapists alike, is trying to help someone who's depressed or anxious. And the attempt to help people is the cause of all therapeutic failure. And what people really want and need most of the time is someone who can listen and understand and empathize with their suffering without trying to help them or change them in any way. And when I say those words, people say they think they understand it, and yet most people can't do that. It requires a good bit of training to learn how to really listen effectively. But that's one thing. But the other thing is that if you're interacting with someone who has some suicidal urges, my own opinion is that, and I can't give advice to anyone, but is to ask the person, are you just having suicidal thoughts, or are you having some actual temptations and urges to hurt yourself? And if the person is having actual urges that they're struggling with, then I would say to bring them to an emergency room so they can be evaluated. Don't try to take that problem on by yourself. And if they refuse you, you can just dial 911 and say to the police, I've got someone here who's suicidal and they're refusing to go to an emergency room, and then they'll come and take the person for a safety check. I once had a young woman who was, can I give you a quick vignette on a suicidal patient? I don't know how we're doing on time here.
We're doing great.
Okay, but I'd been referred this teenage girl who was just fulminantly suicidal and depressed, and she had a severe form of depression called borderline personality disorder. And therapists are typically afraid of this kind of patient because they can be manipulative. They for one day they think you're wonderful, the next day they think you're evil, and they do a lot of acting out in a threatening way that can be very disturbing to the therapist. And so I was working with this young girl, young teenager, young lady, whatever term you want. And she was kind of stuck in her depression, and she wasn't very cooperative. And I said, the thing is I believe I have the tools to help you recover, but you've got to, you come in and you just talk, and support is important, but I have tools to teach you, and you're going to have to be doing psychotherapy homework. If you want to recover, you can't just go to a therapist and talk. You've got to learn the techniques and work at them, write down your negative thoughts, identify the distortions in them, and all these really, really cool techniques. And so she says, I'm not going to do any of your GD homework. And in fact, I'm going to kill myself tonight. And I says, no, you're not going to kill yourself tonight. She says, yes, I am, and you can't stop me. And I said, well, I will stop you. And she says, no, you can't stop me. And she bolted for the door. And so I jumped out of my chair and got between her and the door, and she started screaming and pounding on me. And I could just reach and get the telephone. This was before the 911 thing, and I got it off the hook and dialed An operator came on and said, send the police to this address. I'm fighting with a teenage girl who's trying to commit suicide. And they showed up in 3 minutes, and I explained the situation, and so they took her involuntarily to an emergency room to be evaluated for involuntary hospitalization, and she went out kicking and screaming at the top of her lungs, and I just opened my practice. Like, you're the worst shrink in the world. Don't go to Dr. Burns, this type of horrible stuff. And I went home that night and I said, oh gosh, I'm such a terrible shrink and this is my fault. Then I got to thinking, but what did you do that was wrong? And I said to myself, you didn't do anything wrong. I felt ashamed and guilty, but logically I said, you probably saved her life. And I knew I'd never hear from her again, and I never did. And then I got a call about 5 years later from the Fred Goodwin, who was the chief of the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And he was one of my heroes, although I'd never met him, because as a resident, I did a lot of research on, brain research, and he was one of the top people in the world in, biological psychiatry. And he says, "Oh, are you Dr. Burns?" I said, "Oh, yes. I'm so thrilled to talk to you, Dr. Goodwin. You've been one of my heroes." And then he said, "Did you ever treat a young woman by the name of blah, blah, blah?" Uh-huh. And I went into a panic mode. And I said, "Well, yes, I saw her just a few times several years ago. Why are you calling?" And he says, "Well," and I was really anxious, like I'm going to have an ethics charge, uh-huh. or something. He found me out, I did something wrong. And I said, why are you calling? I said, I just had a few sessions with her. And he says, well, after, she left, working with you, she's seen 13 psychiatrists. And she now has just been admitted to the unit here at the National Institute of Mental Health, and I'm her doctor. And I asked her, did you get any help from any of these psychiatrists? She said, there was only one that ever helped me. And he said, well, who's that? She said, Dr. David Burns. And it was such a shock to the system.
Did it eventually help her? Do you know what?
I don't know if he was able to help her or not. I hope so. But I guess, that message was a very important one, because every patient I've ever had who did the psychotherapy homework has improved dramatically or recovered completely, and everyone who's refused to do it has failed to improve.
Are there? Do you have a team of therapists who do your specific way of working that people can specifically ask for, unlike the David Burns approach?
Well, we call it now Team CBT, and it's like like cognitive therapy on steroids. And there's referral resources on my website, feelinggood.com. There's a referrals page that shows therapists, around the country, and to a certain extent around the world now as well, who are learning this new Team CBT. There's also in Mountain View, California, some of my former students have formed a Feeling Good Institute. It's www.feelinggoodinstitute.com, and they do both training, they do intensives for people from out of town, and they do therapy as well. But if there are listeners interested in the approach, just picking up a copy of Feeling Good, the new mood therapy, would be a good move, because the research studies have shown that 65% of people who are given a copy of the book, if they're moderately to severely depressed, will recover in 4 weeks or improve dramatically just by reading the book. So that's a very inexpensive and often effective first step. It's not a panacea, but millions of people have been helped by reading Feeling Good.
There's a lot of things to still talk about as we speak with David Burns about Feeling Good, the podcast, the website, the book. Adrenal glands. How do they affect a person's ability to find calm or to be anxious? How do you replenish an adrenal gland?
That's out of my pay grade there. That's just, biological stuff that has no causal effect in depression or anything else. People get all excited about, adrenal gland this or adrenaline that. There's a very loose connection between emotional upset and, hyperactivity, the adrenal gland, excess cortisol. But these are not causes of depression. They're just symptoms of depression, and attending to them has no causal effect in recovery other than a placebo effect or something like that. Depression is a total body experience. It affects how you function, your sexual drive, your fatigue, your motivation, and panic and anxiety can be total body experiences too, with a lot of physical symptoms, but they're just like symptoms of your emotional disturbance.
What about passive-aggressive disorder? Dealing with that in terms of meeting people in your life who may one moment be passive, then aggressive. How do you deal with that? Well,
I have another book called Feeling Good Together, and I think it's my most recent book, and it's about interpersonal conflict. And the way I work with interpersonal conflict is I don't deal with these abstract terms like passive-aggressive or people are always blaming others, and that's a way of blaming others for a conflict in your relationship with them. And one of the techniques in Feeling Good Together is, you see, in Feeling Good is based on distortions in your thoughts. Feeling Good Together is based on ways you communicate that create the very problem that you're complaining about. So, and so in the book, I have the reader write down one thing the other person said to you that was upsetting, and exactly what you said next. And then as you analyze that, you discover that you're causing the very problem you're complaining about. It's not that the other person's passive-aggressive, but you're forcing them to behave like that. And this is another death of the ego and a shock to the system. An example of that was a woman who came to one of my workshops. And the problem she had was with her husband. She was kind of complaining about her husband and saying that he can't deal with negative emotions, and so our marriage is passionless because he can't deal with feelings. And so I said, well, what's one thing he said to you, and what exactly did you say next? And let me see if I can remember it, because it's so classic. Like he had said something about, I've been feeling criticized by you a lot, and this really hurts my feelings, and I find it I've been feeling kind of upset and frustrated. And then she said something very punishing, like, kind of like, cut out that BS, I don't want false peace, I'm so sick and tired of hearing you talk like that. This wasn't exactly what she said, but it was something like that. And then And then again, maybe to make a long story short, what she discovered was that her husband had just tried to express his feelings. She said he's a minister. Ministers can't deal with feelings. That was her complaint. But her husband had just tried to express his feelings, and then she had dumped on him. Do you see that?
Yes, I
so
see.
she is the
Seen
one.
that happen many times.
Yeah. And so she's the one who's really afraid of dealing with feelings. She's creating the very problem that she's complaining about, and that's another kind of mystical phenomenon, if you want, but it's very practical.
Why do you think people create their own problems? Is it to learn from them?
No. One of the biggest issues is blame, that we want to blame others and avoid the death of the ego. You see, one of the ways to solve a conflict with someone is to see the truth in their criticism and to show some warmth and humility. But it's painful to see that, and that's another kind of death of the ego. The death of the ego in recovery from a relationship problem is radically different from the death of the ego to recover from depression or from anxiety. There's actually 3 different forms of the death of the ego.
What's the third?
Well, the first is depression, and that's where you have to accept the fact that you're not special. Mm-hmm. It's non-acceptance is the cause of nearly all depression. The death of the ego for anxiety is you have to confront the monster you fear the most and surrender. And that's the woman with the panic attacks. So rather than running from the anxiety, let's bring it on. You called it a double negative, but yes, let's confront this fear. And then she discovered the monster had no teeth, and she became enlightened, euphoric. In relationship problems, it's being willing to look at your own role in the problem. And it feels very shameful and humiliating to do that because we like to blame other people. We feel morally superior. It's like Hitler's thing, like you get a scapegoat and you blame them for your problems and you claim that you're morally superior. And that's the prototype for 80% of relationship conflict.
And that brings us to another interesting issue is self-inferiority complex, Napoleon complex. I mean, one of the reasons why Hitler behaved so grossly and negligently is because he himself was the very lowest version possible of the things that he hated, the beauty that he hated in others. In the sense that when people feel inferior and they feel small, they really want to sometimes buy a giant truck to make up for it, and sometimes they want to make somebody feel worthless. What is it about inferiority, and how can somebody deal with that monster?
Well, when you talk about inferiority, you're really talking about depression, because that's one of the symptoms of depression, feeling that you're not as good as you should be, feeling that you're worthless, feeling that you're inadequate, feeling that you're defective. And as I say, I've developed 50, 75 techniques for overcoming that, because for every person it will be different. But on some level, acceptance is acceptance of the fact that you are flawed, that you are inferior. Now, I'll show you how it works if you want. There's a technique I've developed called externalization of voices. This may be too sophisticated for the listeners to grasp, but we'll take a shot at it anyway. And I have this thing called the acceptance paradox. And so I have the person write down their negative thoughts on a piece of paper. Do you know what some of yours might be when you're in...
My negative thoughts? Yeah. Yes, like I won't have enough money to live on.
Okay, and then what will happen?
And then I'll become homeless, God forbid.
Okay, and then give me more negative thoughts. This is great.
Okay, another negative thought is, I'm thinking, why?
That's an anxious thought, by the way, the two. So now let's do a depression thought.
Negative thought is, why are my art pieces and the things that I share on my verified social media ignored when people who share things like drinking coffee and eating ice cream get like 300 likes?
Yeah.
That bothers me.
Right. And does that cause inferiority or anxiety or anger?
I think most of the time causes nothing, but once in a great while, it can cause any of these things slightly.
Uh-huh. Do you have thoughts that ever make you feel inferior or inadequate or worthless? Because what you asked about inferiority, so I'm trying to get an inferior
Right.
thought. We got an anger thought. That was a should statement. I should get the attention.
I remember I used to feel inferiority when I was much younger. When I was about 12 or 13, I was watching the show Doogie Howser, MD, with Neil Patrick Harris. And he was like a very young doctor, and he was very successful. And I was still 12, but I was very down on myself. I was like, I'll never achieve anything. But at this point, I don't really feel that, but I remember feeling those thoughts.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling inferior, and I was thinking, am I ever going to achieve anything I want to achieve? But thankfully, I am achieving things that I want, except for the monetary aspect. But yes, I felt that way for sure.
Yeah. Well, we'd need some negative thoughts, to
Current
illustrate.
negative thoughts?
Well, or ones that you've had in the past. And
Negative
maybe I
thoughts.
can come up with some from a patient if you can't grab one.
I also remember at that same time, 12, 13, I had an identity crisis. I didn't know what I was or what I wanted to be, and I just felt like I didn't belong here. But that was also at that particular time. A more recent time when I had a difficult time was at the loss of somebody very, very close to me. I completely lost myself, and I couldn't sleep for a month.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
And that was several years ago, and it was exceptionally difficult. And I actually had very strong anxiety and panic attacks at that time. I was able to get through it with your help, just by being on my show, with talking to wonderful people, and through doing art, and through love and talismans, which I strongly believe in the power of certain stones.
Oh, yeah.
So, and also, of course, creating art is very important. So those things, and now I at this point, hopefully in the future, I feel well. I don't really feel these negatives that much, but I remember having experienced them.
Yeah. Well, I can just answer then in a general way that we don't want to overwhelm our listeners with too much information, but when you're talking about inferiority, often we're saying that I need substance X to feel happy and worthwhile. Like substance X might be a great achievement, or it might be love or approval. I must be loved to feel happy and worthwhile. It's a very common one. Or I see people who are depressed to just say, I've never, like I had a woman who lived in Gladwin, Pennsylvania.
Lived what?
In Gladwin,
Okay.
the town. That's the fanciest suburb of Philadelphia.
Okay.
But there are a few, and there's all mansions there. But there are a few smaller, older houses, and so she and her husband had lived there for years, and they weren't very wealthy, and she used to say, I go into the Superfresh in Gladwin, and I see these women with, they have Ferraris and Maseratis and Rolls Royce and Mercedes and BMWs, and they're dressed beautifully, and they were their husbands are making millions, and they're the beautiful people, and they're in the high school. They were the cheerleaders and the top of the class and the captain of the football team or whatever. And how could I feel happy? Because I was just a C student, and I was never one of the popular people, and so I'm inferior. I'm inherently inferior, and people who achieve a great deal, they're more worthwhile. And even though it's not to my advantage to think like that, I think that's true, an ultimate reality. That the Einsteins, the Bill Gates of this world, these brilliant, high-achieving people, they are superior human beings, and that's the system of thinking that leads to depression and feelings of inferiority. And so when I'm working with a person, I've developed dozens of techniques to help the person crush that system and to see through that system.
A lot of it seems to be monetary.
Well, I mean that's the whole achievement paradigm, but then there's also the whole love paradigm. I have to be loved to be happy and worthwhile. So I treated a woman, I talked about her in Feeling Good in the chapter on the love addiction, who learned that her husband had ditched her to have an affair with his secretary. And then she became extremely depressed and saying, I need my husband's love to feel happy and worthwhile, and without his love, there's no way I could feel happy or fulfilled. Those are two of the common systems that lead to depression and feelings of inferiority. I'm not loved enough, I'm not successful enough.
What did you think of Freud?
A cocaine addict, I think, right?
I don't know, maybe a negative of his, but what did you think of his positive contributions?
There's only two that I thought were worthwhile.
Okay.
And I think that he saw human nature as having both a positive dimension and an inherently negative, aggressive dimension. And that I agree with very, very much. The rest of it is just a lot of baloney to my way of thinking. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but he just had this silly imagery. You've got the id, ego, and superego, and it's just a clumsy and ineffective way of thinking about the brain or the psyche, to my way of thinking. And I don't think the psychoanalysis he developed was helpful to anyone. But he has so many followers. People think he's wonderful. At least Jung had exciting things to say.
Yeah.
But Freud, I'm afraid I'm not much of a fan, although I've learned some things from Freud, and I've inherited some of them into the team CBT that we've developed. You know, all of the teachers had certain good points to make.
Three of you are my favorite psychologists.
Okay.
That puts you into...
That's a holy trinity.
Yes, exactly. As we begin to wrap up...
Am I the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit?
You're the Holy Spirit. I'll put the Father as Freud, Jung as the Son, and then you as the Holy Spirit. As we begin to wrap up this incredible, deep, personal interview with David Burns, just a few more questions. So dear audience, check out Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy, Feeling Good Together, 2 separate books, the Feeling Good podcast on iTunes.
And that's free, the Feeling Good podcast, totally free. I guess yours are free too.
On iTunes they are, but then on YouTube, I mean, it's free to listen as well.
Yeah.
And then then there's also feelinggood.com.
Yeah.
Where you can get a lot of written posts by David.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just go into EQ, emotional intelligence. So there's IQ, there's EQ. How many Qs are there? And why is emotional intelligence kind of put in the back burner?
You know, I read so little. I know Dan Goleman popularized that, who used to work for Psychology Today magazine. But I have to confess, I haven't followed his work. But it does seem that, and I can only make my own speculations, that I train mental health professionals, and of course that involves emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and there seems to be quite a huge variation in the aptitude that mental health professionals have. And you can have some people that I've trained who have MDs and PhDs as well, and who publish in the world's top science journals, who can't learn the kind of psychotherapy I'm trying to teach for one reason or another. And then you have some other people come in. We have a fellow in our Tuesday group at Stanford, Sonny Choi, and he went into psychotherapy late in life. He was born in Hong Kong, and his parents, thought that he should become an electrical engineer because he had a little lisp in the way he talked, and so they thought he should avoid the human side of career, so they pushed him into high tech, and he had some high tech career here in Silicon Valley, but he said, I always want to help people. And so he gave up his career and went to get an LCSW degree, licensed clinical social worker, which is a fairly humble kind of degree, but it's a reasonably rapid way to become licensed to do, psychotherapy. And he started coming to my Tuesday group at Stanford, and he had no other training. So he just did exactly what we were, training him to do, and now he's just opened his practice. And he says he's getting recovery from most of his patients in 3 sessions, and he's only allowed to do 35-minute sessions where he works. And he sent me an email yesterday. I posted it on feelinggood.com that he had a woman come in with panic attacks and agoraphobia, and he cured her in one 45-minute session, and then she came back the next week completely free of her symptoms and just in a state of euphoria. And someone like Sonny, he just brought humility and tried to learn, tried to do it. He seemed to have that knack of connecting with people, and he has that healing touch. And I've had other mental health professionals, Matthew May, Jill Levitt. I think they're some of the finest clinicians in the world, really, because they can cause this rapid recovery in people. They're healers, and that is a form of intelligence, and you can train it and learn it to a certain extent, but I think there's an inherent aptitude as well.
Now, pets. How can pets help?
Well, they've taught me so much. I used to be a dog person. When our Samoyed died of colon cancer at age 15. My wife converted me to a cat person, and I've learned so much from cats. They're just so loving. Little Obi, who you can read about on my website, was this feral cat who came to our back door. He was a wild animal, and he came injured. It was just that door right there, except it was just around the corner, and he came and out of the woods, and he had no contact with humans, and he came up to our house, forced himself to come to the house because his right foot was terribly swollen from a fight he'd been in the woods, and we captured him and had surgery done to save his life. He had a puncture wound, and then we kind of adopted him, but he was very paranoid at first and would bite you if you tried to get close to him, and over the months and years, we treated him with love and with kindness. He came to trust us, and he became my best friend in the world. And he taught me an awful lot, in addition to just bringing so much warmth to curl up on my tummy and trust and to be relaxed and peaceful together. But he was not special. He was just a feral animal. He'd been in fights. He's not suitable for a cat show. He's not a purebred. He's just an American short hair, they call it, just a black and white tuxedo cat. And I'm kind of old, and I'm not going to win any contests either. I'm just filled with flaws, and the older I get, the more aware I become of, there's all of my shortcomings. But when Obi and I were together, it was like heaven. It was like the most beautiful feeling in the world, and it's fun to be with you as well, just hanging out. Yes. On this tape recorder, yes. Pretending we have something to say. and he kind of taught me that he's not special, I'm not special, but when we didn't need to be special, life became special. The heavens open up. That's a gentle death of the ego. That's what the cats have taught me.
Beautiful. 2 more things, and then we're going to be done. You mentioned a very interesting story. It took 8 years for your book, Feeling Good, to be #1. And the story was?
Well, yeah, just to make a long story short, when the book came out, I find it was very difficult to get it published. And then right after it was published, my editor called and told me that they have a loser list. I might have told you this the last time we talked. I don't remember, but that the president of the company at the time was William Morrow and Company. She said 9 out of 10 of our books lose money, and we're looking for the one where we'll make up for all the rest. And so the president develops a loser list of all the books that he was sure would lose money. And she said my book was #1 on the loser list. And what it meant is that they would not support the book with any kind of advertising, marketing, or whatever. And that whatever advertising it was going to get, I would have to do on my own. And it was very difficult for 8 years. I was, trying to get on a radio show or a TV show or a newspaper interview with very, very little success. But I finally got a break 8 years after the book was released. I got on the old Phil Donahue show, which was like the Oprah show. It was the biggest show nationally, and about halfway through the show, a woman in the audience said, "Are you the author of Feeling Good?" And of course, that's what the whole show was about, but, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, and I'm talking about cognitive distortions and all of that, and so I says, "Yes, I'm the author of Feeling Good," and she says, "Oh, now I understand." She said, my son was depressed and had decided to commit suicide, and someone gave him a copy of your book, Feeling Good, and it changed his life. And I owe it to you that my son is alive and he's happy, and I think everyone in the United States should go out and buy a copy of your book right away. And within 5 minutes of the end of that show, the book had sold more than it had in the previous 8 years put together. It had about 30 printings, but they were all little printings, and it went to the top of all of the bestseller lists.
Exquisite story. And then the encore question. There's a story you mentioned to me, if you feel comfortable sharing it in any way possible, about a Holocaust survivor who was afraid of ghosts of some sort. And then there was a rug involved in a basement. Is there anything of that?
Yeah, that's another terrific story that's about finding your own ladder.
Yes.
And that there's no one thing
Yes.
that's going to do it for everyone. But this was a fellow was referred to me as an elderly man, and he had escaped from Nazi Germany and made it to New York, and I think all the rest of his people died in the concentration camps. And he worked shining shoes on the streets of New York, but worked hard and eventually started to work his way up in the world, and eventually became an extremely wealthy New York industrialist, and he manufactured I don't know what, but he had owned many square blocks of New York City. But he said he'd been depressed every minute of every day since he was a little boy, and he'd had years of therapy, pills. No one had been able to help him with his feeling of worthlessness. And every generation has fads in psychiatry and psychology and mental health, like this one thing that's supposed to cure everyone. Like for Freud, it was free association on the couch. That was supposed to be the health pill for all human beings, I guess. And then at that time, it was aerobic exercise. Now it's mindfulness meditation that's supposed to be the holy grail of mental health. But
they're all united in a way, though. They all come from the unconscious.
Yeah, that's a good point. But the idea was that if you exercise, it'll raise your brain endorphins, and then you'll find happiness. And so I said, well, I'll check this out. I was jogging a lot, long distances at the time, fairly long, and so I got him running. I said, your whole problem with worthlessness is that you don't have enough brain endorphins. So I got this poor elderly fellow, I think he was 81 years old or something, jogging 12 miles a day. And then I said, now Ezekiel, how did you feel at the beginning of that 12-mile run? And he said, I felt like a worthless human being. And I said, and then how did you feel at the end of the 12-mile run? And he said, I felt like an exhausted, worthless human being. It just had no effect whatsoever on his mood. Now, some people are helped by exercise, but I think you have to have a specific intervention that targets someone's negative thoughts and crushes those negative thoughts. And so finally he confessed to me why he felt worthless. And he said that all of his life, since he'd been a little boy, he had a claustrophobia and a fear of the dark. And he thought this meant he was a weak human being, a weak man. It wasn't manly to feel that way. And he'd been hiding this his whole life. And as he told me, he was just sobbing because he thought it was so so shameful that he had these phobias. Well, now I was able to prescribe a specific technique to crush those problems. And I told him to get up some night at 3 in the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning, pitch black, go down into his basement with all the lights off, and roll himself up in a carpet like this, so he'd be trapped with claustrophobia and he'd be in the dark. And no matter how panicky he got, to stay there until he was cured. And I said he could have a tape recorder going, and every minute he could say what he was afraid of and kind of how anxious he was between 0 and 100, and then he could bring that tape, to the next session. Well, he resisted this. I won't go into that story, but after some weeks of fighting over it, because he thought this was a terribly dangerous recommendation, he didn't want to do it, and he finally agreed to do it. And then he came back the next week, and he said that for the first 15 minutes, he was 100 on a 0 to 100 scale of panic. He was lying there in the dark in his basement, and then he had the thought, which he would say out loud, that he thought a ghost would come out of the dark and sit on his chest and suffocate him. And so he kept waiting for this ghost. And then after 15 minutes, no ghost had appeared, so he kind of blurted out, you could hear this on the tape recorder, "I'm tired of waiting for you. If you're going to do your thing, if you're going to sit on my chest, come and do it. I'm ready." Still no ghost came, and then you hear him burst into uncontrollable laughter, where he realized there isn't any monster, and his fears went to 0, and he was cured after what must have been 75 years of failed treatment. And then that was his ladder, that was his form of enlightenment. And that's why I think you have to have specific techniques, because what worked for him then wouldn't work for you. What's working for you won't work for Sam or Habib or whoever.
But the therapist has to have the imagination, the spiritual quality, and the empathy to help create that. And you have those.
Thank you. Those are all important parts, I think, of good. Empathy is good. It's not enough, but it's important, and technology is important. Compassion is important as well.
Thank you. We've been speaking with David Burns, MD. Again, you can find his extremely successful book and additional books, Feeling Good, at any store, mostly Amazon, his website, feelinggood.com, his podcast on iTunes, complimentary, the Feeling Good podcast. And I hope you enjoy more shows of the Archetypal Mosaic.
Thank you so much. It's always fun working with you, and I look forward to edition number 3 at some point.
Me too. God bless.